The execution order was stamped, sealed, and signed, and Vessel knew, the moment Kessin held it up in the grey morning light of the Ashfen market, that the signature was wrong. Not wrong in the way of a forgery constructed by someone who had never seen the original. Wrong in the specific, technical way that only someone who had spent 3 years handling royal documentes in the Thorn archive would recognize. The pressure distribution of the pen strokes, the slight forward lean of the capital letters, the way the C in Kedron curved just 2 degrees too far to the left. The Alpha King signed his name the same way he did everything else, with the precise, unvarying consistency of a man who had made every motion deliberate enough that deliberate had become automatic. This signature had been made by someone trying to replicate that consistency. Trying, not achieving. He did not sign this. Vessel thought. The thought arrived with the flat certainty of a fact, not a hope. She had handled enough authentic documents in 3 years of archives work to know the difference between the real thing and a very good approximation. This was a very good approximation. It was not the real thing. Vessel Cray, Kessin's voice carried the professional neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped being news to him. He was holding the order at eye level, displaying it, not offering it. Former Omega of the Thorn Royal Pack, currently residing in the Ashfen border settlement under name Vera Callan. He lowered the document. His pale eyes were entirely without warmth. You have been located pursuant to an active execution order issue by the Alpha King's office. You will come with us. Around them, the morning market had gone the specific quality of still that crowds produce when they understood that what was happening in their midst was not something they had the standing to interrupt. Vessel did not look at the crowd. She looked at the document. She looked at the signature that was not his. 3 minutes. Cale was at the cottage. 3 minutes from this market stall, in the care of the neighbor's daughter who came on market mornings. 3 minutes was not a distance that could be crossed, but 6 armed soldiers closed the gap between them. She had one thing available to her. She had been saving it for exactly this scenario, not with hope, but with the grim practicality of a woman who understood that the only insurance policy worth keeping was the kind that could not be confiscated. If you are new here, do not move. What this woman does in the next 4 minutes has been 3 years in the making, and the man whose name is on that order has no idea it exists. Stay with me. Vessel looked up from the document and met Kessin's pale eyes directly. The first time in her life she had looked at an enforcer directly, because Omega Caste Protocol made direct eye contact with authority figures, an act requiring specific permission, and she had spent 3 years being very careful about protocol. She was done being careful. That signature, she said quietly, is not the Alpha King's. Kessin's expression did not change. He had been told she might say something like this. He had been told to expect it and to proceed regardless. What he had not been told was that she would reach into her coat and produce a second document, smaller, older, folded into an oilskin sleeve with the specific care of something that had been moved across 4 provinces and 3 years without being allowed to deteriorate. She held it up. This one is, she said. She had not always been nobody. Once, Vessel Cray had been the kind of nobody that was different from the nobody she was now, the invisible. Functional, entirely overlooked nodie of a low-ranked Omega who performed essential work in spaces that higher-ranked wolves passed through without registering. She had cleaned the archive's lower vaults. She had catalogued income documentation. She had moved sealed folders from one section of the Royal Administrative Wing to another with the quiet efficiency of someone who had understood, very early in her employment at the Thorn Court, that the fastest way to remain employed was to be completed before anyone thought to check whether she had been started. She had been good at this. She had been, in fact, exception at it. In 3 years at the Thorn Court, she had become so thoroughly integrated into the archive's background that senior officials had dictated sensitive correspondence in her presence without pusing. She had learned, in that time, the precise cadence of a council meeting being held at volumes calibrated for privacy, but not for the acoustics of a storage vault with an open ceiling vent. She had learned the specific smell of a document that had been handled by multiple people before filing, the layered oils of several different hands, which was different from the smell of a document that had been handled by one person very recently. Alone. She had learned, most usefully, the Alpha King's signature. Not because she had studied it with intent, because she had processed enough of his authentic documentation across 3 years that the visual pattern of his handwriting had become as familiar to her as the archive's shelf numbering system absorbed through retition rather than attention, stored in the part of the brain that filed things below conscious retrieval but above complete inaccessibility. She had not understood, until the morning Kessin held the execution order up in grey light, how important that familiarity was going to be. The bond had formed on a Wednesday. She was precise about this, not because the day of the week was significant in itself, but because precision was how she processed things that resisted processing, and the bond resisted processing significantly. A Wednesday. The lower archive. She had been working late because a water seal on one of the vault doors had failed, and she had been rehousing documentation before the moisture reached it, which was the kind of task that fell to the Omega on duty regardless of the hour. He had been there because she had not known at the time and had reconstructed afterward. Once she understood what had happened, he had been conducting one of the private, unannounced inspections of the administrative wing that she later learned were a regular practice for him. He came without announcement specifically because announced inspections produced performances. He moved through the archive the way he moved through everything, without the weight of his own presence as a tool. She had not known who he was for approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough time for a bond to form between two wolves, enclosing a proximity whose blood had already made the relevant determination, which Vessel had not known was possible without ceremony, without formal recognition, with either party being aware it was happening. She had learned this afterward, from the one text in the archive's restricted medical section that addressed the phenomenon, which she had located and read in approximately 40 minutes once she understood what she was experiencing and had access to the appropriate index. The bond had formed. She had felt it, that electrical rewiring, that primal certainty, and had understood. In the same moment, she understood what it meant. That the man standing 4 feet from her was the Alpha King of Thorn, and that nothing about her situation was going to be simple from this point forward. He had left with either of them naming what had happened. She had not named it either. She had made the same calculation she applied to every variable that threatened her function stability, assessed the risk against the available options, found no option with an acceptable risk profile, and filed the information under unresolved while she continued rehousing documentes from the failing vault. She had discovered the pregnancy 6 weeks later. She had discovered the execution order 4 weeks after that, when a misfiled folder passed through her hands on the way to their restricted section, and she opened it without thinking and found her own name at the top of a document bearing the Alpha King's signature. She had been out of the capital within the hour. Ashvin had not been a plan. It had been the third place she stopped, the first two having felt insufficiently distant and insufficiently unaffiliated for the specific category of disappearance she required. The border settlement sat at the edge of territory that no pack formally claimed, populated by the specific category of person who valued the absence of official attention for reasons of their own. They had not asked questions about Vessel. She had not offered answers. She had established her as a record keeper, the only formal skill she possessed that translated cleanly to civilian use, and had built a practice across 3 years that gave her enough income to pay rent and buy food and keep Kale in boots that fit. Kale had been born in the settlement's medical cottage on a winter night with a midwife present and no one else. He had arrived with his father's black hair and his father's ice-blue eyes and his father's quality of absolute, focused stillness and a set of abilities that Vessel had not anticipated and had spent 3 years managing with the careful, methodical tension of a woman who could not afford to let anything she managed slip. The abilities had started small. Temperature variance in rooms where Kale experienced strong emotions, nothing dramatic. Nothing that could not be attributed to a drafty window or a poorly sealed door by anyone without reason to look more carefully. By his 2nd year, the variance was more pronounced. By his 3rd, it was unambiguous to anyone with wolf senses when Kale was frightened or angry. The air around him dropped in temperature with a specificity that had nothing to do with weather. Vessel had researched this in the settlement's limited library and then, through careful correspondence with an archivist she trusted, in the Thorn Court's public records, she had found one reference, a single paragraph in a historical count of the Thorn bloodline's distinctive abilities, listed among traits documented in direct line alpha descendants across 4 generations. Environmental resonance, the unconscious expression of dominant wolf energy as atmospheric effect. Documented in the Alpha King's grandfather. Documented in the Alpha King's father. Last documented, according to record, in the Alpha King hymns at age 4. It had not been documented since because there had been no subsequent direct heir. Until Kale. The Easter egg was this: every time Kale had a nightmare, which was not often, because he slept with the specific heavy completeness of a child, who exhausted him thoroughly during waking hours, the temperature in the cottage dropped low enough to make breath visible in the air. Vessel had documented this from the first occurrence, noting the pattern, the duration, the recovery time. She had also noted, and this was the detail she had not been able to explain with any reference material available to her, that on the mornings following these nights, every window in the cottage and the 2 adjoining units was sealed with a thin layer of ice on the interior surface. not the exterior, the interior. As though something had pushed cold outward from the center of the building, through the walls, and sealed every potential point of entry against whatever the nightmare had contained. She had told no one. She had added it to her internal accounting of reasons why the timeline she was working with had limits she could not fully predict. She had continued to rebuild her archive skills into record-keeping practice. She had continued to move the oilskin sleeve containing the execution order whenever they moved, which had been twice in 3 years. Because a document that could not sound was not insurance, and she had no other insurance available. She had rehearsed what she would do when Kessin's unit finally found her. She had rehearsed it until the rehearsal felt as automatic as the Alpha King's signature. She had not rehearsed what she would do if, at the precise moment, Kessin held the execution order up in grey morning light. A second figure appeared, at the far end of the market, moving toward her with the specific, unhurried directness of a man who had not come through the settlement's main entrance. She had not rehearsed that because she had not believed it was a realistic variable. She had been wrong about that. Hedron Vale Torn had not come through the main entrance. This was deliberate. He had learned. Across 12 years of conducting unannounced inspections of facilities that had advance warning of unannounced inspections, through channels he was still in the process of identifying that the main entrance of any location was the entrance that people prepared for. The eastern livestock track that skirted Ashfin's mark perimeter from the border road was not an entrance anyone prepared for. It was muddy, narrow, and smelled comprehensively of its primary users. He had been using it for 4 days. The investigation had brought him here through a chain of documentation that had taken 4 months to assemble, not because the evidence was scarce, but because whoever had constructed was and the forgery had done so with the specific, layered care of someone who understood that a single anomalous document was detectable and a consistent pattern of anomalous documents was a system. And systems were significantly harder to dismantle once you understood they had been built intentionally. Sadron had been dismantling it one document at a time in the private hours of 4 months, in his own hand, without involving anyone on his council. Without involving anyone on his council, specifically because the evidence pointed, with increasing and then irrefutable clarity, toward his council, toward one member of it in particular. He had arrived in Ashfin 4 days ago to locate a woman named Vera Callan who had been flagged in border settlement records as a former Thorn Court employee operating under a name that the settlement's registrar had noted in a marginal annotation that Cedron suspected was the most consequential bureaucratic footnote in the territory's recent history did not match the phonetic patterns of the southern border region where she claimed to originate. He had spent 4 days watching the settlement before approaching it. He was crossing the market's eastern edge when he saw Kessin. He recognized the enforcer before he recognized anything else, the compact build, the pale eyes, the specific quality of stillness that Kessin's unit maintained in operational positions. 6 soldiers, standard suppression formation, surrounding a woman at a market stall who was holding a document in an oilskin sleeve with the flat, prepared composure of some who had been rehearsing this exact moment. Kedron stopped walking. He was 40 feet away, downwind from the market, which meant the wind was coming toward him from the direction of the stall, carrying the sounds of the confrontation and everything else the morn air contained. The bond hit him like a structural failure. He had suppressed it for 3 years with the specific discipline of a man who had felt something form in a lower archive on a Wednesday night and had made the deliberate, calculated decision to not act on it until he understood what it was and what its implications were, because acting on incompletely understood informations was how kings made catastrophic errors. And he had made that calculation and filed the bond and requires further assessment and had then, systematically and without adequate justification, not assessed it further. He had told him this was strategic patience. He understood now, with the comprehensive clarity of a man receiving 3 years of suppressed information in a single unmanaged instant, that it had been something considerably less defensible than strategic patience. The bond surfaced with everything it had been storing. It hit his sternum first, the electrical charge of recognition that moved outward through his chest and down both arms to his fingertips and up through the back of his skull, with an urgency that his body had apparently been accumulating since the last time he had been within scent range of the woman now standing 40 feet away with a document in her hands and 6 of his enforcer units around her. His wolf, not suppressed, never fully suppressed, simply held at the specific tension of a dominant alpha who had learned to keep his nature on a very short leash in public settings, reckoned her with a sound that did not reach his throat. He was already moving. He covered the 40 feet in the unhurried, direct manner of a man for whom urgency expressed itself as efficiency rather than speed, no announcement, no increase in pace that would telegraph his approach to Kessin's unit before he was ready to be detected. He was 30 feet away before the nearest soldier's peripheral awareness registered a new variable in the environment. 20 feet before that soldier's training produced the correct identification. 10 feet before Kessin turned. Kessin turned and found the Alpha King of Thorn standing in the Ashvin market in traveling clothes with no escort and no banners, and the specific expression of a man who had just received a significant quantity of clarifying information and was in the process of deciding what to do with it. Kessin's face did exactly what faces did when they encountered a variable that was not in the operational briefing. Hadron did not look at Kessin. He looked at the woman. She was looking at him. Her eyes green, lighter than he remembered, carrying 3 years of something he did not yet have a complete vocabulary for, held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had prepared for many possible versions of this moment and was now in the actual version, which was different from all the prepared versions in ways she was still processing. She did not drop her eyes. He noted this. In 3 years of court memory, every Omega in the Thorn Pack dropped their eyes within the first 3 seconds of his direct attention. Everyone. She did not. The bond between them was fully present, no longer suppressed, no longer filed under anything, simply there with the weight and permanence of something that had always been structural and was now done pretending to be optional. He looked at the document in her hands, at the oilskin sleeve, at the specific way she was holding it, not clutching, not performing, simply presenting, the way an archivist presented primary source material. Controlled. Intentional. The gesture of someone who had been waiting for the correct recipient. Then he looked past her. The child was standing at the edge of the market stall, half sheltered by the wooden post, watching the proceedings with ice-blue eyes. His eyes, the specific shade and depths that the Thorn bloodline produced in direct line descendants, document in court genealogical records across 4 generations, as distinctive and unreplicable as a seal impression. His eyes, in a face that was otherwise entirely the woman's face, looking at him with a focused, unhurried assessment of a 3-year-old who had not yet decided what category to fie this stranger in. The air around the child was colder than the surrounding market by a temperature differential that Cadron felt on his skin from 8 feet away. He understood everything in the space of one breath. The execution order, the forged signature, the 3 years, the border settlement, the record keeper named Vera Callan, who was not from the southern border region, the document in the oilskin sleeve that she had been saving for the correct recipient. He understood why Mast had needed her to be dead before she delivered. He understood what a living hair, a direct line hair carrying environmental resonance, the most unambiguous genetic marker in the Thorn bloodline, meant for every political arrangement Mast had spent 12 years constructing. He understood that his most trusted advisor had forged his signature as a death warrant for the woman carrying his child, and had spent 3 years sending enforcement units to execute that warrant. He looked at Vessel. "How long have you had that document?" he asked. Her voice was entirely steady. "Since the night I left," she said. "I took it from the fire on my way out." I thought, a pause. Measured. The pause of someone selecting the accurate rather than the veiled one. I thought that if I ever needed to prove I was not the thing the order said I was, I would need the thing that proved the order was not the thing it claimed to be. He held her gaze for a moment. "You knew the signature was wrong." "I knew it the moment I saw it," she said. "I had hand enough of the real ones." Behind her, Kessin had not moved. He was conducting the rapid internal accounting of a man who had arrived with a clear operational mandate and had just found the subject of that mandate in direct conversation with the authority that had issued it, or rather, the authority in whose name it had been fraudulently issued, and was trying to determine which variable in this situation superseded which other variable, and in what order. Kedron answered that question before Kessin finished ask it. He turned to face Enforcer with the ice-blue eyes that had never needed volume and said, in the quiet conversational register that was the most unambiguous communication available to him, "Step away from her." Kessin did not step away. This was, Kedron noted with the detached precision of a man conducting a real-time assessment, an formative choice. A soldier who received a direct instruction from the Alpha King and did not comply was not confused. He was not slow. He was operating under a different authority structure than the one he was presenting, which meant the instruction he had received from that structure was specific enough and reinforced enough that even the Alpha King's direct order did not immediately override it. Mast had been thorough. Kedron filed this alongside everything else he had been for 4 months and gave Kessin 4 seconds to reconsider. Kessin used the 4 seconds to reconfigure his formation instead. 2 soldiers moved to flank Vessel's position. 2 more shifted to block the market stall's exit points. The fifth positioned him between Kedron and the child with the specific practiced efficiency of a unit that had rehearsed this exact scenario, which meant Mast had anticipated the possibility of the Alpha King's presence at the execution site and had briefed his enforcer unit accordingly. The sixth soldier reached for the suppression cord at his belt. The cord was oriented toward Vessel. Vessel saw it. She moved before the soldier completed the reach, not toward escape, not towards the child, but toward the post where Kale was standing, placing hers between the cord and her son with the automatic. Absolute, zero hesitation motion of a woman for whom this particular positioning had become as reflexive as breathing. She reached him in 2 steps and put both hands on his shoulders and turned him so that he was behind her, against the post, with her body as the barrier between him and every threat in the market. Kale looked up at her face. Then he looked around her at the soldiers. Then he looked at Kedron, who was 8 feet away and had gone very still in the way that Vessel had not yet seen, but that every soldier in Kessin's unit had just registered with the involuntary physical awareness of prey animal, detecting a predator shifting from passive to active. The temperature dropped. Not dramatically. Not all at once. A steady, incremental decrease that began at the center of the market stall and moved outward in a radius that had nothing to do with the morning air, and everything to do with the 3-year-old pressed against his mother's back with his ice-blue eyes fixed on the soldier, holding the suppression cord. The soldier's breath became visible. He looked at his own exhaled air with the expression of a man whose training had not included this specific variable. That, Kessin said, his voice carrying the flat quality of someone identifying a threat category rather than expressing alarm, is the environmental resonance. Confirmed, present. The order extension covers it. Vessel's hands tightened on Kale's shoulders. Order extension, Kedron said. His voice had not changed volume. It had not changed tone. It had changed in the way that things change when they drop below the register of communication into the register of something else entirely, something that did not need to communicate because it simply needed to exist and have its existence understood. The original order covered the woman, Kedron said. What does the extension cover? Kessin held his gaze for a moment. The heir, he said. The advisor's assessment was that an unregistered heir carrying bloodline ability constituted an independent succession risk. The extension was issued 6 months ago when the settlement's medical records indicated the child had begun displaying. Stop. One word. The market stopped. Kedron released his alpha aura. Not with the explosive totality of a dam failing. With something considerably more precise and considerably more frightening, the controlled, systematic release of a dominant alpha who had spent 12 years developing the specific skill of deploying his nature as an instrument rather than a reaction. Not everything at once. The exact amount required. Applied with the accuracy of a man who had decided that this situation did not warrant a display of power, but a demonstration of its irreversible presence. It was enough. The soldier with the suppression cord stopped moving. He did not drop the cord. He did not go to his knees. He simply became capable of completing the motion he had been in the middle of, his arm rest mid-reach, his motor function receiving. a message from a level below conscious override that communicated, with complete clarity, that the motion was not going to be completed. Kessin held, trained, experienced. His hands were shaking. Short now, fast. The world contracting in the space between decisions. The flanking soldier on Vessel's left shifted his weight forward. Cadron was between him and Vessel before the shift completed. One motion. Not violent. Absolute. The soldier's forward momentum met a redirection that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with the specific geometry of a dominant alpha, placing him in a space and making that space unavailable for any other purpose. The soldier found him facing a direction he had not intended to face, 3 feet from where he had been, with no clear accounting of how the transition had occurred. He did not try to reverse it. The flanking soldier on Vessel's right read the outcome of the left flank's attempt and made a decision. He stepped back, placed his weapon on the ground, stood with his hands visible. The decision of a professional who had just recalibrated the available options and found only one with an acceptable outcome. 2 soldiers at the exit points looked at each other, looked at Cadron, sat down simultaneously, with the resigned efficiency of people arriving at the same conclusion through parallel reasoning. Kessin had not moved. He was still standing in the center of the formation that had ceased to be a formation, with his pale eyes tracking Cadron and the specific quality of a man who had been given an operational mandate and was attempting to determine whether the mandate's authority superseded the authority of Kurikar. Marked stall. He was taking too long to determine this. Cadron walked toward him. Through the reconfigured soldiers and the dropped weapons and the cold air that Kale's distress had pulled into the market and that had not yet fully dissipated. Unhurried. The deliberate, measured pace of someone for whom this was not emotional management but task completion, the final item in a sequence that had been in progress for 4 months and was now reaching its conclusion. He stopped 2 feet from Kessin. He looked at him with the ice-blue eyes that had never required temperature because they were already cold. The document in her possession, Cadron said quietly, establishes that the original order was issued fraudulently, under a forged signature, with intent to circumvent the succession. He tilted his head fractionally. You have been executing an order that was never authorized by the authority whose name it bears, which means every action taken pursuant to that order, including 3 years of pursuit, including the extension order, including this morning, was conducted without legal standing. Kessin's jaw worked. The advisor's seal. It's not my seal, Cadron said. Soren Mast is my advisor. He is not my king. His seal authorizes administrative correspondence. It does not authorize execution orders. It does not authorize orders extending to minors. And it categorically does not authorize actions taken against my mate. The word landed in the market air with the specific weight of something that had been withheld for 3 years and was now irrevocably said. His mate. Vessel, standing 10 feet away with Kale pressed against her back, heard it. He saw her hear it, saw the specific, involuntary response move through her body. the bond answering the word with the 3 years of pressure it had been storing. She did not move. She held her still with the same iron discipline she had applied to everything else this morning, and looked at him with the green eyes that had not dropped once. Kessin looked at the market, at his unit, at the dropped weapons and the seated soldiers and the still air of a confrontation that had ended without the confrontation he had been briefed to expect. He looked at Cadron. "I was following orders," he said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat honesty of a man who understood that the statement was not a defense, but was at least an accurate accounting. "I know," Cadron said. "That is the only reason this conversation is still happening." He reached into his coat, removed the restraint cords from his own belt, the ones he carried not as a standard enforcement tool, but as the specific, legally designated instruments of Alpha King custody, which were a different category of restraint entirely, and whose use was documented under a different section of territorial law. He held them out to Kessin. "You will place these on yourself," he said, "and you will tell me, clearly and completely, every instruction Soren Mast gave you regarding this operation. The original mandate, the extension, the briefing regarding my potential presence at the site, and anything else you were told that you have not yet disclosed." He paused. "You will do this because the alternative is that I consider you a knowing participant in a conspiracy against the royal succession, than an instrument of it. And the legal outcomes of those two classifications," his voice remained entirely level, "are not comparable." Kessin looked at the restraints for a long moment. Then he took them. Across the market, the temperature was slowly, incrementally returning to normal. Cadron looked at Kale. The child was still behind his mother, still watching, still conducting the unhurried assessment he had been conducting since the moment the Alpha King entered the market. The ice blue eyes, his eyes, moved from Kessin, placing restraints on his own wrists, to the seated soldiers, to his mother's back, and then to Cadron. Kale looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped out from behind Vessel. Not towards Cedron. Simply out, separate him from the shelter of his mother's body by 1.5 feet, planting both feet, and regarding the situation with the self-possessed assessment of a child who had decided the immediate threat level had decreased to a manageable level, and was updating his position accordingly. Vessel turned. She looked at her son, then at Cadron, then back at her son. "Kale," she said carefully. "The cold air is going away," Kale said, with the matter-of-fact tone of a child reporting a weather observation. "I made it so that when I was scared." "I know," Vessel said. Kale looked at Cadron. "Were you scared?" he asked. Cadron held his son's gaze. "No," he said. Then, with the specific honesty of a man who had decided that this child deserved accurate information from the first word, "I was angry. On your mother's behalf. The cold air you made, I understood what it was." Kale considered this. "What was it?" he asked. "Protection," Cadron said. "You were protecting her." Kale looked at his mother, looked back at Cadron, "That is what I do," he said simply. The market was very quiet. The market settled into the particular quiet of aftermath. Kessin seated on the ground with the Alpha King's custody, restraints on his wrists, delivering his full operational briefing in the flat, precise manner of a man who had made his calculation and was honoring it completely. The soldiers, those capable of standing Pazinton under the market's perimeter under the garrison soldiers, Cadron called in from the eastern track with 3 words and the royal seal pressed to his communication disc. Cadron listened to Kessin's briefing with the focused attention he applied to all information he intended to use, not reactive, not performing response, simply receiving and filing with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had spent 4 months assembling a case and was now receiving the final materials needed to complete it. The briefing took 11 minutes. It covered 4 operational mandates, 2 extension orders, the advance briefing regarding the Alpha King's possible presence at the execution site, and 1 additional item that Kessin delivered last, in a slightly different register than the rest, the register of a professional disclosing something that had troubled him enough to alter his delivery cadence. Mast had issued a standing order 18 months ago. If the heir was located and the execution could not be completed cleanly, the heir was to be taken separately, brought to the capital under a sealed transfer order, processed through the court's unaffiliated ward system under a fabricated identity. Not killed, removed, made inaccessible, placed where he could not be found by anyone who did not already know where to look. Cadron absorbed this without visible response. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything that required his full attention completely, in the moment, without the partial processing of a man who was simultaneously managing his own reaction. The reaction was present. It simply waited. When Kessin finished, Cadron nodded once. Then he removed the royal seal from his coat. He spoke the arrest order in the flat declarative register of a man reading from a decision that had been finalized 4 months ago and was now being executed on the timeline the evidence had finally made irrefutable. High Advisor Soren Mast is to be placed under immediate arrest on the following charges: forgery of the Alpha King's signature on an official execution order, conspiracy to obstruct the royal succession, issuance of unauthorized enforcement mandates in the Alpha King's name, and conspiracy to unlawfully remove a recognized heir from territorial custody. A pause. The weight of the next clause measured before release. All counts authorizations bearing Mast's counter-signature are to be suspended pending individual review. All enforcement units operating under his direct authority are to stand down and report to Garrison Command for debriefing. This order carries the full weight of the royal seal and admits no delay. He put the seal away. He looked at Kessin. The garrison commander will receive your full deposition. Your cooperation this morning will be reflected in the tribunal's assessment of your role. A pause. What you were told to do to the child will not be. Kessin held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. The nod of a man who had arrived at the outer boundary of what his professional neutrality could sustain and had found. At that boundary, something that looked like relief. The garrison soldiers collect him. The market emptied with the quiet efficiency of a space that had hosted something significant and was prepared to return to its ordinary function once the significant once the Cynicon had concluded. Stall holders who had frozen in place began moving again. The crowd that had maintained its careful, respectful distance began to disperse. Within 10 minutes, the Ashfin morning market was producing the ambient noise of commerce, and the only evidence that anything had occurred. In its center was the cleared space around the stall where Vessel was still standing and the cold air that had not yet fully dissipated. Kedron stood in the cleared space and looked at her. She had not moved since the garrison soldiers arrived. She was still holding the oilskin sleeve, the document she had carried for 3 years, moved across 4 provinces, kept as the single piece of insurance available to a woman with no other protection. She was holding it with both hands now, loosely. The way you held something once you understood it had served its purpose and could be set down. She had not set it down. He crossed the space between them. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the document in her hands. Then he looked at her face, at the 3 years written into it, at the composed steadiness that had not broken through any of this morning's events, at the green eyes that were watching him with, the specific quality of a woman who was still in the process of determining what the last hour meant for the architect of every decision she had made since a Wednesday night in a lower R5. He held out his hand. She looked at his hand, at the document, back at his hand. She placed the oilskin sleeve in his palm. He took it. He held it for a moment, the weight of it, which was negligible as a physical object and considerable as everything else. Then he looked at her with the ice-blue eyes that their son had inherited and said, without preamble, and without the framing language of a man managing how information landed, "I did not sign it." "I know," she said. "I knew when I saw it. You have been carrying the proof for 3 years." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment with the full weight of that, not deflecting it, not structuring it into something more manageable, simply holding it in its actual dimensions. Then he went to his knees. Not a stumble, not exhaustion. Deliberate, chosen, fully conscious descent, both knees on the worn stone of the Ashfin market. The complete weight of everything he was arranged into an act that had nothing to do with the Alpha King of Thorn, and everything to do with the man who had filed a bond and requires further assessment and had not assessed it for 3 years, while the woman it connected him to was living under death warrant, bearing his forged name. He did not reach for her hands. He looked up at her face with the ice-blue eyes and the stripped-down honesty of a man who had used up every layer of governance and was operating of them. "I am not apologizing for this morning," he said. "This morning I was here. This morning, whatever I did or did not do, I was present." His jaw tightened once. "I am apologizing for the R5. For the Wednesday night I filed under assessment and did not assess. For 3 years of a bond I suppressed because acting on it would have required me to act on incomplete information, and I had told mice that was strategic patience when it was." He stopped, found the accurate word. Cowardice, of a very specific and considered kind. He held her gaze. "You carried a forged death warrant with my name on it for 3 years. You raised our son alone. You built a life from nothing in a border settlement, because the alternative was a court that had decided you were a liability." Something moved through his expression that was not designed for public observation. I can return 3 years. I cannot give Cale back what he did not have, or give you back the Wednesday night when I should have said what was happening instead of filing it. He exhaled once, slowly. I can only tell you that I understand. I am beginning to understand exactly how large what was taken from you was, and I intend to spend whatever time you allow me accounting for it properly. The market was very quiet. Vessel's eyes were bright. She had not cried in 3 years. She had made this a policy with the same grim precision she applied to every variable that threatened her stability. Crying required safety, and she had not been safe, and so she had simply stopped. She had been consistent. She had been thorough. She was not thorough now. A small warm weight pressed against her left side. Cale. He had abandoned his post against the market stall. He leaned against her hip with one hand and reached towards Kedron with the other. Not hesitantly, not with the caution of a child approaching a stranger, but with the matter-of-fact directness of a boy who had conducted his assessment and arrived at his conclusion and was acting on it. He placed his small hand on Kedron's bowed head. The cold air in the market dissipated completely. All at once. Not gradually, simply gone. As if it had been waiting for exactly this resolution before releasing its hold on the temperature. Vessel let the tears come. Once. Just this. Just here. They did not leave Ashfin that day. Kedron made this decision within the first hour, not announced, not discussed, simply enacted through the practical actions of a man who had understood what the next several hours required and had no remaining interest in a timeline that predated this morning. The garrison soldiers secured the settlement's perimeter. Kessen's unit was transferred to the capital garrison under sealed custody orders that Kedron wrote him in his own hand, with his own signature, the real one, the one Vessel would have recognized instantly. He was aware of this as he signed them. He signed them anyway. Cale watched him sign from his position at the table's edge with the focused attention of a child who had decided that observing the way this particular man handled documents was useful information worth collecting. Kedron showed him the signature when he finished. "This is what it looks like," he said. "The real one." Cale studied it with appropriate seriousness. "It goes forward," he said. "The letters lean forward." "They do," Kedron said. The other one did not. "No," Kedron said. "It did not." Cale nodded, filed it, returned to his observation post. The formal recognition was conducted in the settlement's administrative hall as the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows and stretched legs long across the stone floor. Kedron had sent for the garrison's documentation officer, the only official present with the correct instruments and the correct standing, to witness formal royal registry entries in the field, and had spent 40 minutes drafting the documents rather than dictating them. This was not standard protocol. Standard protocol involved a secretary, a scribe, and 3 council witnesses. Kedron had no council members present that he was prepared to trust with this documentation. He had a garrison officer, a documentation witness, and his own hand. He had decided this was sufficient. He had decided, in fact, that it was preferable that the first documents in the official record connecting his name to Vessel's and to Cale's would be written in his own hand, with his own signature, with no intermediary between his intent and the ink. He signed Cale's recognition document first. Cale Vale Thorn, first of his name, recognized heir to the Thorn Alpha seat and sole succession holder of record. His birth formally entered in the royal registry with immediate retroactive effect, backdated to the date of his birth. His bloodline abilities documented as confirmation of direct inheritance, environmental resonance, active and operational. The first document expression in the direct Thorn line in 11 years. The false gaps in the succession record to be formally annotated in the archive with a full accounting of its origins, not quietly corrected but publicly examined, because Cadron had decided that the mechanism of what had been done needed to be part of the record. Then the second document. Vessel Cray Thorn, recognized Luna of the Thorn Pack. The bond between them formally acknowledged under ancient pack law. Its 3-year suppression noted in the official record, not as an administrative absence, but as the document consequence of a fraud now subject to full tribunal proceedings. Her former Omega classification struck entirely, not reclassified. Not upgraded through the standard rank progression, but removed on the grounds that it had never accurately reflected her standing once the bond existed. He signed this document last. He looked at the signature for a moment after he made it. Then he looked at Vessel, who was standing across the table watching him with the green eyes that had not dropped once since the market, and he slid the document across to her. She read it. He watched her read it, watched her reach the clause about the Omega classification, watched something in her face saw the specific, involuntary thing that faces did when they received accurate information about something they had been carrying incorrect for a long time. She set the document down carefully. Later, she said quietly, for him alone. I am going to need some time to understand what it means that all of this is real. He looked at her steadily. You have time, he said. As much as you need. Ashvin was not overlooked. Cadron spent the remaining afternoon hours in the settlement with the documentation officer, conducting a review that had nothing to do with the census mandate that had brought his enforcement units here and everything to do with what the settlement had provided, shelter, anonymity, and the specific protective indifference of a community that had asked no questions about a woman with a child and an Omega caste mark and a name that did not match her regional phonetics. The settlement received formal Crown protection status. Not pack absorption, Kedron understood, without being told, that a community that had survived by remaining outside formal structures would not find absorption into those structures a meaningful form of recognition. Crown protection status meant something different, acknowledgement, document in the royal registry, that this settlement existed and that its existence was under the direct consideration of the Alpha King's office. The registrar who had annotated Vessel's false name with a marginal note about regional phonetic patterns, the annotation that had, through a chain of documentation, attributed to Cadron, finding her, received a formal commendation and a practical recognition that Skidron calculated would make the next several years of the settlement's administrative work, Reinslad, Ekug, small things. But Cadron had spent 4 months learning that small things, document correctly and honored consistently, were the lode-bearing elements of everything larger. At dusk, Cale stood at the settlement's western boundary and watched the last light leave the fields with the patient, self-possessed attention of a child who found this worth observing fully. Cadron stood beside him. They had found, across the afternoon, that they were comfortable in parallel silence, the specific silence of two people who process the world by watching it rather than narrating it, who found another watcher's presence companionable rather than demanding. "Will we go the capital?" Cale asked. "Yes," Kedron said. "When you and your mother are ready." Cale considered this. "What is it like?" "Large," Kedron said. "Complicated. Full of people who are going to find you very significant very quickly." "Will they be afraid of the cold air?" Cadron looked at his son. "Some of them," he said honestly. "The ones who should be." Cale absorbed this with the grave consideration it deserved. Then he slipped his hand into Cadron's, and they stood at the boundary together until Vessel came to find them. And then the three of them walked back through the settlement's western gate into the lamplight and the warmth of the hall where the signed documents wait on the table, the real ones, with the real signature, saying what the signature should have said 3 years ago. High Advisor Soren Mast is in custody tonight. His tribunal will convene within the fortnight, and the charges against him will dismantle 30 years of constructed influence in proceedings that the council cannot manage or contain. But here is what I can't stop thinking about. Mast had 12 years of access to the Alpha King's name. 12 years of opportunities to sign documents he was not authorized to sign, for purpose he was not authorized to pursue, in the name of an authority he did not hold. The execution order is the document we know about. The investigation has been open for 4 months. How many documents are there that the investigation has not yet reached? Tell me in the comments what you think Mast was building, because the execution order was not the beginning. It was the one that got found. If this story stayed with you tonight, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The archive is still being searched, and we are only just beginning.